Hello, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us. My name is Vince Chadwick. I'm Devex's Brussels correspondent. Today, we've got the second in a three-part series on the intersection between space-based technology and climate change, and we're in partnership with the satellite applications Catapult. We've got a really great set of speakers with us, from Pacific activists working on the front lines of these issues to UN experts, to representatives from industry as well. So it's really, we've covered the field, I think, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from everyone. So let's get straight to it. So I'm joined now by Dylan Carver from Fiji. Hi, Dylan. And by Brianna Fruean from the Pacific Climate Warriors in Samoa. It's great to have you both here. And you guys were in COP in Glasgow at the end of last year together. So my first question is, I suppose, what did you make of the event from your perspective being there? There were lots of different interpretations flying around in the media: a great success, a terrible failure, depending on who you ask. And we've had a bit more time now in the months since to digest a little bit about what came out of it tangibly. So I'd be interested to know whether how COP in Glasgow really has given you a direction for your work in 2022 as well. But perhaps to start with Brianna asking what you made of the event itself.
Thank you, Vince, for having us. Reflecting back onto COP, I really feel like we were in a space where there were small steps taken where we needed large leaps. And so I could definitely see that there were wins that a lot of us were getting within the policy space, within a few of the activism space, especially within our smaller communities and groups where we were mobilized and organizing. But we all know that we needed much more. And I think, if anything, it taught us that there's so much more work to do, and that work really continues now. And, we can't expect 2 weeks out of a year to solve the climate crisis. And so coming into 2022, I feel like more so than ever, climate activists are ready to really keep pushing the envelope.
Dylan, what about you? That sound similar thoughts from you?
Yeah, definitely very similar thoughts. I think with me, one thing that was really surprising was, it was my first COP as well. So I think I came with kind of optimistic eyes as well. And just seeing how things panned out, how crazy things can get. It really, young people in that space, and I spoke to a few people, it can make you feel rather deflated within those 2 weeks. But then honestly, it's kind of coming together with other young people as well in that space. So basically, the UNFCCC processes are kind of very deflating. The meetings are long. It's very exhausting. But the atmosphere is really what drags you through. It really pulls you through. And 100,000 people marched on the streets of Glasgow in one of the final days. And I think that really put a high on things, just seeing how young people had come together in such a big way to march for climate justice. But yeah, the Pacific really came with some big asks, some big demands, on loss and damage, on a few other key elements as well. And I think, this is one thing that the Pacific in particular is good at doing, is remaining optimistic, regardless of the outcome. So regardless of what's being said in the media post-COP, I think the steps that we've taken is a good direction. But as Brianna has said, we needed leaps. We didn't need these small steps forward. But yeah.
Either of you or both of you seen the film Don't Look Up on Netflix? Does that resonate with you in your activism and what you experience going between the Pacific and then going to places like Glasgow?
I would say that not as much as I thought it would, because I think in Don't Look Up, it was like a revelation, right? That people were going through, like, oh my gosh, this horrible thing's happening and no one cares. But I feel like for Black and Brown communities, horrible things have happened to us throughout history and nobody has cared. Climate change just so happens to be the thing that is impacting everyone, no matter the color, the race, or where you are in the world. Climate change will impact you at different rates and different strengths. But I feel like for a lot of us that are in the work, that are in the front line of the crisis, there wasn't like this shock factor to it. We kind of grew up knowing that there's injustices that exist, and climate change is a symptom of those injustices.
Yeah, and I totally agree with Brianna. That was exactly the discussion that I had with some of my friends is, this is a conversation that we've been having from such a young age, and it's only coming into I use this word very loosely, but into the mainstream now. And it's kind of being like, we've been shouting these calls for such a long time, and it's only when the impacts are being felt by these Western countries that it's really coming into the mainstream discussion, and it's really disheartening as well. But I think the good thing about that movie, and the thing that I thoroughly enjoyed about the movie, was the ending, because it didn't paint a rosy picture. It painted what we are headed towards, what we're barreling towards, and if we remain on this trajectory, that's the ending that we'll have in real life as well.
Wow, that's so interesting to get that perspective. When you went back to your home countries after COP, what did you say was there a disconnect between what people at home thought and took away from the event and what you being there thought? Or did you have to do any kind of translator explaining about what had gone on, or you felt like everyone had the similar understanding about what had been achieved and not achieved?
I basically, in Fiji in particular, COP and the COP space tends to be highly politicized. And so you have quite a range of discussions happening in the country. But when I returned, COP is generally a very technical area. So you had to explain a few things, explain the processes. A lot of people were interested in, what happened behind this, what impact did, for example, Obama have coming into the negotiation so late. And so a lot of discussions had to happen, and there was a disconnect. And as you said, a lot of people were criticizing it, but then the climate activists that were there were very optimistic because they were there on the ground, kind of experiencing these things as it happened.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Dylan has shared. Because COP in itself is a political space, it's so hard to get your finger on the pulse of what exactly people are thinking of it, if they're thinking about it at all, right? And so a lot of people in our communities, they live within the climate crisis, but they wouldn't really follow COP because, coming back from COP, one of the immediate things for us in the Pacific is it's cyclone season. So we're living within the negotiations that are happening at COP, but not necessarily always following it. And I think it's almost a luxury to follow COP if you're not working within those spaces, because it just means you have the time to actually attend these conferences and follow these online talks and not have to be worrying about boarding down our houses and building up our seawalls for cyclone season. So it's a very hard thing to really get a sense of what the general consensus of the public reaction to the conference was.
Yes, and I did want to maybe jump in here and
go ahead.
You were right on the ball, Brianna, about having your finger on the pulse, because at COP as well, it's kind of young activists and the people that are engaged in the CSO space, and their kind of direct line and their engagement with their negotiators is also something that needs to be looked at as well, because I reckon that there was a disconnect there as well. And better cooperation, better communication would have benefited us there as well.
What can you say what you mean by that, Dylan? Some examples, perhaps. It's quite interesting.
It's just, for us, it was kind of like two separate spaces. We were operating outside of the negotiating rooms, and then our negotiators were acting inside the negotiation rooms. And just the level of communication I felt in my experience could have been a bit better. But then I guess all the work is probably done, before coming to COP anyways. But just that level of communication while things are happening, just so that we are able to track the progress that's happening in the negotiating rooms, and the progress that has been made at that exact moment. So kind of more of a coordinated approach.
Okay, fantastic. We have to wrap it up, I'm afraid. Of course, this event is about how some space-based technology can assist in the issues that we're talking about. We didn't get around to talking about that much, but I think that's because you've set the scene so perfectly for what's at stake here. So I'm really grateful to both of you for taking the time to speak to us today. Thank you. So I'm joined by Simonetta Di Pippo, the Director of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs and the co-chair of the Global Future Council on Space at the World Economic Forum. And Simonetta, I told a friend I was interviewing the Director of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs, and they were very jealous. And they said, that sounds like the coolest job in the world. She has the coolest job title in the world. I don't disagree. But I did wonder what's the average day look like for the Director of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs?
Well, that's an interesting question, and please tell your friend that yes, I'm very honored of his about his opinion. It's quite an interesting job, and I cannot tell you that there is, a standard typical day. In a nutshell, what the office does is to try to bring the benefits of space to everyone everywhere, in particular focusing on developing and emerging countries, but in general, trying to use more and more space-based data and infrastructures to improve the quality of life. And this means that more or less space can be found everywhere in our day-to-day lives. And so what we are trying to do is really to get it done, which is quite a big challenge, if I may, which implies to work with delegations, so with member states, with governments, with space agencies. We work a lot with the private sector, with academia, and also with research centers and the civil society, so with a lot of NGOs. In reality, it's quite a broad range of stakeholders. But it's also true that since, as I was mentioning, space is across the board, all the main topics or the main challenges that humanity has to face right now, well, it's also natural, if you want, that our stakeholders are part of a so broad range. In also, user communities are not necessarily dealing with space, but they are, let's say, the recipients of the benefits. So my day, typical day, may go from big meetings inside the UN, meetings with delegations, multilateral, bilateral, trying to, we have also the register, we maintain the register of the objects launched into outer space. So we register every day new satellites in our online, on our website, etc., etc. So it's quite a broad range of different topics. And so that's the reason why there is not a typical day, but all of them are really interesting.
I could say the same thing about my work with Devex, I think, hence the chance to speak with you today. So that's good to hear. I also saw that you're a special advisor to the Secretary General. I wanted to ask, what is he worried about space? What is he excited about space? What's the nature of your conversations with him when it comes to this issue?
Well, let's say that there are two main, streams. One is that I keep him informed every time I see that there is something that has, some political nuances that is happening in space. So it's a regular, update that I provide him. Currently, we are working on what he announced last September 2021, a report called Our Common Agenda. And this will bring us to the Summit of the Future which is currently scheduled for September 2023. Under the umbrella of the Summit of the Future, one of the 7 high-level tracks is space, and in particular space, focusing on space traffic management and global governance. So you know that, satellites, the number of satellites launched is increasing every year. The number of space debris is, as a consequence, increasing quite a nice speed. And so we do need to have a common understanding of how to have a responsible, let's say, approach for space operations. And so the only body able to use its convening power to bring all the stakeholders at the same table is the UN. So we're working hard on the Summit of the Future, at least I'm working hard on the space part, but I'm very happy that we decided, or together, and he decided to include space as one of the most important topics for this summit.
And how does climate change fit into your work? I mean, I'm not sure if you could give us a figure. Is it 20% of the time, 60% of the time, 80% of the time? I'm from Australia, obviously, and quite a remote part of the world. Quite key to understanding just basic information about what's going on. So could you give us a sense of how climate change intersects with the kind of things you're working on?
Well, the most, let's say, important answer, there are a lot of nuances also on this, but the most important answer in this case is that, that we have to monitor what we call the essential climate variables for climate. And they've been classified, there are 54 essential climate variables, and more than half of these variables can only be monitored precisely and accurately from space, which means that without space, we cannot have precise information on what is going on from the scientific perspective, and collectively, we cannot have, let's say, the right approach vis-a-vis mitigation and adaptation. So without space, we cannot tackle the climate crisis. At the same time, what you get from space is really something reliable, precise, repeatable. So in reality, the advantage of monitoring these variables from space is absolutely, how can I say, mandatory if you really want to try to deal with this issue on a global scale. And you have also to consider that space is a key tool across the board, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. In September 2015, the UN, so the 193 member states, approved the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, they range from climate action to land use, from, gender equality to quality education, zero hunger. there are a lot of different smart cities. There are a lot of different topics. And if you look at that, space is really across the board. And also climate in a way is linked to a lot of these SDGs. So they are strictly interconnected.
And it's interesting you mentioned all those different SDGs and not just climate and energy issues. What do you think when you see billionaires going into space, or the criticism which I think space exploration has faced since it began, that we should focus on the problems here on Earth? It seems like you're really working on the way space can help people on this planet, but every time there's a launch, carbon emissions go into sending the rocket into orbit and things like that. How do you see that dichotomy that sometimes is presented between space exploration, space travel, and space work, and problems on our own planet?
Well, space, okay. For me, it's crystal clear. I've been devoting my entire life to space activities. It's now more than 35 years. And this is a recurring question, I have to say. But if you look at how many things we do and we benefit from space, during our day, really every single minute of our life. If I may, probably, and this is something that I'm always asking myself, and and with this job, I believe I'm doing a lot in trying to increase awareness about the importance of space. But believe me, sometimes when I'm talking to people from other user communities and I say, okay, let me know how I can help you with space-based technologies. And they look at me saying, okay, but first tell us how important is space for us? Which kind of space-based solutions you have? And so that's the reason why I've been starting a project which is called Space Solutions Compendium, where we plan to deliver, to have a sort of a one-stop shop, being the Office for Outer Space Affairs, for where, from everywhere in the world, if you have an issue and you want to find, to see if there is a space-based solution, you can come to us. If we have the solution, we propose it. If we don't have a solution yet, we can try to support you on everything you may need. So that's a way for us to increase awareness, to try to really underline the importance of space on everything we do. Even getting money from an ATM is not possible anymore. An ATM machine is not possible anymore without space, or using your navigator in your car, or check the weather during the day. So all of this is based on space, and probably we have to increase our efforts in spreading the word around. If we talk about billionaires, well, despite the narrative, and we can discuss about the way in which they present what they're doing, from my perspective, it's a way for opening up a new era. If you look at what happened with, flying with airplanes long time ago, the beginning of aviation was more or less the same, more or less, not exactly the same, but more or less. And we can make this parallelism. The made in space, so products developed in space, living and working in space, it's in the future, but far closer than what you can think of.
That's nice to hear. Now, we're conscious of time, but you mentioned the compendium. Can you give us a time frame about when that might be available?
We are already working on it. We are already designing the website. So I hope it will be soon, but clearly it will be incremental. So every time we find new solutions, space-based, they will be included. So we'll start soon, but then it will be improved and improved with increased, let's say, knowledge that you can find on the website.
Fantastic. Okay, Simonetta De Pippo, thank you very much for your time. Great to speak to you.
My pleasure.
Well, we're joined now by Leba Gonovinaka, who is in Fiji. Unfortunately, for technical purposes, she wasn't able to join us today. She's working with the United Nations on satellite applications with the Fijian government. We began by asking her a little bit about her role, and then she gets into answering our questions about how satellite applications can assist as we address the effects of climate change.
What do I like most about this role and this job? I've always, enjoyed being in a position where I can influence and make a difference in communities across Fiji and the Pacific. So that has always been what drives me. I value and develop all these networks for that purpose, and to be able to contribute where it matters, to see a gap and see how you can address that, to make lives easier and to improve livelihoods for our people. So working for UNICEF for the Common Sensing Project and other work that UNICEF is currently involved in the Pacific, I saw opportunities of helping people, with the tools, capacities, and access that these initiatives bring. And Earth observation, remote sensing is a very specialized field in this part of the world. It began really to support natural resource inventories and asset management. Its applications in climate change tends to be fragmented across the sectors impacted by climate change. But having that hub, to bring a lot of this coordinated data and analytics to the office responsible for climate change, where I'm embedded, should help. That's our contribution to Fiji and to impacting lives on the ground. satellites sure helps us see a lot more than we were able to decades ago. So with these, improved sensors, we're able to detect and extract a lot more information that tells us about our changing environment. In a way, helps us to monitor and manage these resources. In the Pacific, we have a lot of cloud cover. However, with satellite images, especially around certain islands, we can run cloud masking, etc. But there are some islands like Taveuni that you really need ground truthing or drone surveys to obtain better images for such very small communities, highly covered in clouds. So combining space-based insights with ground truthing and information from people on the ground is essential, to contextualize and verify the situation. And this feeds into, improved data, useful data that can strengthen our decision support systems, and that helps seeds, better report on their commitments and be better positioned to receive the support that they need from international partners to meet their obligations under the Glasgow Pact. Well, for one thing, the Hunga Tonga, Hunga Hapai eruption has, been reported to be a 1 in a millennia event. So from what I understand, a lot of not just regional warning systems, but also global systems were designed to detect and issue warnings for mostly earthquake-induced tsunami events around this area based on observation data collected over the years. And the eruption that happened in Tonga, this was such an outlier of an event in our modern history that the models didn't quite encapsulate its kind. So it's one of the lessons learned moving forward. So it comes down again to community response plans as well. So you have, like if you have been issuing a lot of warnings and signs, improved, strengthened outreach to look out for these signs. Like there are these traditional warning systems that helped people mobilize to higher ground. When we felt the shock waves and heard the blast, which initially sounded like gunfire, then you had social media posts going up confirming there's a volcanic eruption in Tonga, and the Hunga, Tonga, Hunga Hapai had, erupted, and there's a possibility of a tsunami. So people, based on traditional signs of these shock waves and the sounds, started moving to higher ground. So that also, we can relate to the preparedness efforts and the awareness and outreach that's gone into the community before that. So when you detect the signs, even if the sirens don't go off immediately, evacuate to higher grounds. Don't take any risks if you live along the coastal zones, which a lot of the Fijian communities do reside within coastal areas. And in terms of the aftermath of the eruption, in terms of response, I would commend the Fijian DMO for utilizing the existing disaster response network that Fiji has through its cluster systems to establish contact with Tonga and mobilize immediate response. So we had government, development partners, and humanitarian agencies in the Tongan community really come together in a few days to stock up 11 containers to ship to Tonga, responding to their most urgent needs. That was communicated by the Tonga New York office. And UNASAT also provided very timely preliminary and post-disaster damage assessments as part of the activation of the International Space Charter. That's always helpful for first responders to gauge the initial impact, to gauge the situation on the ground based on such early assessments. So that was something resourceful that UNASAT contributed as well. I would say small island developing states would be on top of that list. There are a lot of countries suffering the impacts of climate change, but I believe seeds are among the most vulnerable as climate impacts are exacerbated by our specific development challenges. We have, like in urban areas, promoting compliance to building codes. awareness and campaigns for building back better. But in rural areas where people's main concerns are just about survival, getting your kids to school and surviving, there's that challenge in promoting resilient or costly infrastructure when most of these areas in the highly exposed areas to tropical cyclones are in a constant state of reconstruction. So that's an issue for Fiji. It's a challenge we are trying to address, and the solution is something that needs to be driven across all levels. Then, we have the case of our Pacific Island neighbors, Kiribati and Tuvalu, small island states, whose future really lie in the balance, due mostly to sea level rise. So in terms of our expectations around where the next big wave of climate refugees is going to come from, we have that as an example. We have the case of Tuvalu. They purchased about 5,000 acres of a piece of land in Fiji, in the northern part of Fiji, that is being secured for the future of their people as a proactive response to the risks of being displaced in the future. So this is part of their response plan to addressing this climate crisis.
So we're joined now for our next session by Barbara Ryan, the Executive Director of the World Geospatial Industry Council, Lucy Edge, the Chief Operating Officer of Satellite Applications Catapult, and Nick Wise, the CEO of Ocean Mind. So welcome everyone, and thanks for being with us. My first question is, what was going through your heads as you sat watching, like all of us, the hours tick away in Glasgow at the end of last year, and over the Christmas New Year break? What did you really distill for your own work out of what came out of the Glasgow summit? I thought we might start with Lucy.
Thanks, Vince, and thank you for having me today. I think COP26 was a bit of a roller coaster for all of us, and especially those of us based in the UK. The lead up to it felt a combination of exciting and the potential to miss a great opportunity if we didn't get it right, if we didn't land it right in time for the COP26 sessions. So I think there's always more that can be done, and like many, I was disappointed with the last minute changing of wording. But what I do think we got from COP26 was a feeling that we have agreed what we need to do now, and now we have to, in inverted commas, just do it. And that for me is actually a slight move forward, because we now can focus on delivery, we can focus on solutions, and really push hard on that.
Nick and Barbara, would you agree with that?
Nick, go right ahead.
Okay, I would certainly agree with the run-up and how things felt as it progressed. A roller coaster is probably a good description for it. Personally, I was particularly pleased to see that nature actually got a seat in some of the discussions where perhaps it's been a little left out in the past, and a recognition, particularly from the recent report of the AR6, that highlighted without doing something to help protect and preserve biodiversity in nature, actually, even if we hit the targets we've set ourselves, it's not enough. So nature is an intrinsic part of the solution. So I was particularly pleased that that was recognised, given that that's sort of our area of interest.
And I'll just jump in there before Barbara, I ask you. Nick mentioned that nature got a seat. I wanted to ask whether space got a seat. Did it feature in conversations as much as you would have liked?
Let me jump in on that point, and I was only there virtually, okay, but certainly through the Earth Information Day, that is now a sanctioned event for the COPs. It was always kind of a side informal event, and this was the first. I think this time, maybe the last one was the first time it was actually a regulated event, and space absolutely got a seat there. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in this session, I think. The only thing I guess I would add, everybody, is it's just hard work. The roller coaster is a great analogy, because your emotions just get so high and you get so excited about what's going to happen. And then governments move slow. It's just slow and it's just hard work. And for all the frustration that might have existed afterwards, I think you saw some of the work is, well, what other mechanism are you going to use to bring governments together? It is what it is. And so we've just got to kind of dig in and leverage every single bit of this process that we have.
So sorry, Barbara, if I may, how did it? Maybe we can. I didn't fully explore in the introduction all of your respective roles, but it'd be interesting to know, Barbara, a little bit more about the Geospatial Industry Council and how you saw the outcomes of Glasgow connecting to your work. One of the questions I had was actually how big the geospatial industry is. As a layperson journalist, I've actually got no idea how it compares to. So just a bit of an overview would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, because I should have that number globally, economically, Vince, and I should provide it to you guys later. How it, well, first of all, WGIC is a not-for-profit entity, but you have to be a private sector company working in the geospatial or Earth observation ecosystem to join. So, but we're not for profit. And so what worked really well for us is in working with Climate Trace, and Nick may talk about this a little bit later. It's part of a consortium that he belongs to, former Vice President Al Gore, and then the UK high-level champion Nigel Topping got together and held a high-level dialogue in advance, like back in December, about space technologies. As an outgrowth of that high-level dialogue, a couple organizations came together and said, let's put a report together that looks at who's doing what in monitoring greenhouse gases from space. This is something that the public sector has been all over for decades with the Committee on Earth Observation Satellites, but no one has ever taken the time to compile what the private sector is doing to monitor greenhouse gases from space. So if we bring that full circle, this COP was, to the best of my knowledge, the first time that we were able to bring a systematic analysis of both the public and the private sector into the deliberations. Now, on a limited or very narrow range, who's doing what for the 3 greenhouse gases that are monitored by the convention or regulated by the convention, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. But what worked really well for WGIC is, rather than having every individual company speak, then this not-for-profit organization called WGIC could speak on behalf of the entire industry. And I think, for me, that speaks really well to public-private partnerships, and I'm sure a lot of other points that we'll get into in this debate. So we're not for profit, but all of our members are private sector, and you have to be in the private sector, small startups, all the way to the companies that are working globally.
Okay. Nick, how does OceanMind fit into this picture, into this this piece of the puzzle?
Well, OceanMind, it started as part of the satellite applications Catapult, and we use space technologies to understand human impact on the ocean. And so initially that work was focused on fisheries and how you use satellites and then artificial intelligence to detect these fishing activities, understand the compliance of those, and help the regulators enforce their regulations more effectively. The theory being that there are regulations already managing most of the most damaging human activities on the ocean, but the reason that we have declines in ocean health, declines in biodiversity, and drive towards certain species extinction is because those regulations are not well enforced in all places. And so by using these technologies, we can help the regulators enforce more effectively. That set the scene for us meeting with Gavin McCormick of What Time Climate Trace, and looking at this idea that he had in his conversations with former Vice President Al Gore about how could the carbon emissions of all of humanity from all of our industries and sectors be monitored independently through the use of satellites and so forth. So those conversations took place between a range of organisations. We obviously know things about what's happening on the ocean, so we can look at things like the shipping industry, and we can estimate the carbon emissions from the shipping industry. But there are a range of other organisations within the Climate Trace Consortium, such as What Time, who look at energy outputs, carbon emissions from use of energy, and a range of others who are looking at all the different aspects of emissions, and it's all derived from observation. So whether it's satellites or sensors, but space is absolutely crucial to our understanding now of human-caused emissions.
Just before I bring in Lucy, I've got another layperson's question. We often have the impression that with our phones, we're visible all the time. And there was a moment recently when the earthquake hit near Tonga, and I woke up and was trying to get information. And someone in New Zealand said, well, a plane has left New Zealand, so we'll know more soon about what's going on in Tonga. And it was this very strange moment where I thought, hang on a minute, are we saying we don't know what's going on? Are we saying we don't know what Tonga looks like right now, or what's happening? And it was and I think a similar thing tragically happened with the disappearance of MH370 as well, where there are blind spots still on this planet. And so I'm curious to ask this group of experts, where are the gaps that you're seeing that satellites can help to fill and can really play a role in these critical moments? Maybe I'll ask Lucy to come in on that one.
Yes, thank you. The Tonga earthquake and the volcano and the ash cloud that resulted was very similar to the one that happened over the north of Europe a number of years back, in terms of knocking out not only imagery from satellites, but also affecting their ability for the nations to communicate. And so I think the first thing to always say about anything to do with space technology is it should be part of an overall solution. Space technology is fantastic. It's got some really interesting, unique capabilities, which I can go into in a sec, but so does terrestrial technology. And actually, if you really, really want to keep us all connected in a safe way, then we need a combination of the two, and we need resilience in our systems. And that's what we saw wasn't really available in the recent circumstances. I think the story with aeroplanes is slightly different because they've had this old technology historically with the black boxes on board, and that's now changing to be much more connected in commercial airspace. So that's a slightly different example. Do you want to come in?
I did have a question on that about how the two technologies and people on the ground and satellites work together when it comes to climate, and how do you link up those two?
Yes, and that for me is the real sweet spot in what we do next. If you look at the work that Nick does at Ocean Mind and the data that Ocean Mind uses, it's a combination of sources. If you look at something like the geospatial work, where Barbara's a world leader in that area, it's again a combination of information. It's a combination in geospatial of imagery and really high precision location information, none of which you can transfer without the communication capability. And all of that can be achieved from space. So that's where the power comes from the space technology. There are no international borders. There are no constraints in space to say, well, you can go here, but you can't go there. Your orbit defines that for you. So that ubiquitous coverage is really powerful with the multiple different technology capabilities. So the imagery and the location information, really high precision timing, and also the communications of the data. But when you then combine that with the terrestrial technology, to get really ubiquitous coverage, that's the sort of 5G, 6G world that we're talking about a lot at the moment at the Catapult and in many other places. And that's really important because its goal is a lot about some of the boring stuff around policy and protocols, because what we really want is that the end users are agnostic. That capability to communicate should be everywhere. And you shouldn't have to pick up your phone and say, right, well, today I'm going to use satellite connectivity. And when I get into the town next door, then I'll switch to 4G. You shouldn't have to do that. It should all be really embedded in our global system of connectivity. And when we reach that point, we can start getting some really powerful data back. And that's the tag that I think we've historically called big data, but we've kind of moved on from that phrase now.
I can see Nick nodding vociferously. Nick, what's stopping us getting there? What's stopping us getting to this point that Lucy's describing?
Well, I think in some senses it's investment, but in some other senses it's just progress. It's time. If you look back 5 years, some of the things we're doing now wouldn't have been, well, they might have been imaginable, but we couldn't have achieved them. So the pace of change is significant. So we've completely changed over the past 5 to 10 years the scope of what can be seen, how much can be seen, how often it can be seen from space, the capacity of moving data through space-bound technologies, and the connectivity you can have between terrestrial capabilities and satellite capabilities. So these interlinkages have transformed with the development of new technologies, new capabilities, cloud computing to manage all of the data, etc. Because we're talking about huge amounts of data. If you look at just one of the European Space Agency satellites, you're talking about petabytes of data a year. So who's going to look at all of that? Well, of course, no one but a computer. So all of these computer technologies needed to advance before you'd be able to take advantage of these things. So it's a question of things moving forwards and other things catching up and overtaking, allowing new things to happen and so forth. So it's not a clearly designed path where the end goal is fully understood and everyone's moving towards it. It's lots of innovations happening that advance our capabilities and give us another 5 to 10 years. And indeed, we'll have ubiquitous connectivity or ubiquitous observing or the ability to hear and see things that are going on wherever we need to in order to manage things like these natural disasters. Today, we're on the journey to get there.
And Barbara, if I can bring you back in on that point about new technologies, what's got you excited as an expert in this field for a long time? What are the things you're looking at that you can't wait to come online and be more available?
Yeah, there are a couple things on that, and I will go back to one of the remaining challenges to your earlier question, but whether you call it the mirrored world or the metaverse or digital twins, I think we're going to, our ability to model what's going on and just replicate the Earth is emerging. And I think that's going to actually, that's going to move us forward a lot so that people can actually visualize what changes might happen. So of course, the introduction of artificial intelligence and machine learning so that machines are learning will I think push humans to learn. So digital twins for sure, and artificial intelligence and machine learning are just really growing very rapidly across the whole industry. One challenge, well, there are 2 points I'd like to make, Vince, to your earlier question. Governments in particular still need to adopt broad open data sharing policies. You know, the argument is that the citizens have paid for those sensors, the stream gauges or volcanic monitoring sensors or satellites, and the data that emanates from all of those needs to be broadly and openly available. And so until governments get there, that's going to be a rate limiting step. And then the last thing, just to maybe go back to Lucy's comments, I think this most recent underground volcanic eruption that occurred in the South Pacific, I think that was actually an outstanding example of what is working. You had geostationary satellites that are, 35,000 kilometers above the Earth that just hover over certain parts of the Earth and are taking data every 15 minutes. And so it was first captured, with those satellites. And then you can come down to the next suite of satellites, which go as the Earth rotates. They're collecting data everywhere, and it's a higher resolution data, takes more time, but you can see more features on the ground. And then with going just back to the GHG monitoring, as you come in with private sector capabilities, you're seeing even higher resolution data. And that's just from space, because then tying Nick's point in, you know, we were able, through the ground-based monitoring system, able to trace that pressure wave from that volcanic eruption. I think maybe 3, maybe even 4 times around the Earth that one feature moved before it got so low that you couldn't quite distinguish it between, you know, kind of regular movements. You were only able to get that from networks of observations that governments and the private sector have from space and from the ground. So obviously much destruction on the ground, and you know, that I think will speak to a lot of the work that Catapult's doing too, to, you know, look downstream for those impacts. But you know, we're seeing advances every year on the space, in space and on the ground.
And are those stationary satellites, are they in the right areas? Are they over the right parts of the world, or are there still, if you could put a few more up, where would you put them?
Yeah, there are still holes, and a lot of times well, in the global south, there are still holes. I mean, there's a lot of ocean. Nick is probably better to talk about this than me, but the ocean is a gigantic part of this planet. And so observations from space over the ocean areas are still needed. But I don't know, and I actually should know this, I don't know the total number of geostationary satellites, but largely operated by governments and then coordinated through the World Meteorological Organization, so that they all, you know, can share data within that group of governments. And so as the Earth rotates, these satellites are moving at the same time the Earth is. And that's why you can get data every, you know, 10, 15 minutes over a certain part of the Earth.
How do military satellites figure in all of this? Is there enough sharing going on? Because, you know, sometimes I have the impression that there's the technology we know about, there's the technology that they don't want us to know about. And maybe that would be useful as well. Is there enough sharing going on between that? Or if you want to know what's going on in the Sahel and you talk to France, maybe they don't want to tell you what they know about what they can see. How does that work?
Well, I think
go ahead,
world that, thank you, Barbara. The world that we live in at the moment is different from when we first joined the space era. You know, it's hard to not know what's in space these days. You can see it from the ground using optical because it's very reflective, or using something called passive RF, so you can tell where there are spacecraft in space. So we pretty much know, everybody who does the tracking, and there are numbers of organizations around the world, know what's where. I think there is a very strong understanding, most of the nations we work with from the UK now, and in the UK too, that the collaboration between defence and civil is really the right way forward for space infrastructure. There's lots of needs that are similar, and there are a few needs that are different. But the more that space becomes a part of our security capabilities and also our national infrastructure at a critical level, then they become more and more part of the same story anyway, a bit like transport systems do, and so on. So, you know, the working across defence and civilian space is much closer now than it has ever been. And I think that's a real positive. I think if you look at the space sector and what it can bring to our climate challenges that came out of COP26, we probably all know the statistic that 2/3 of the essential climate variables either can be best monitored from space or can only be monitored from space. And if we talk about some of the terrestrial sensors as well, and Barbara's given a few examples just now, the way that they work best is if they're well connected. And quite often the permanent answer to that in remote locations is also using geostationary connectivity or low Earth orbit communications networks in space as well. So whether you're using terrestrial data or data from space can play a really important part in measuring, using some of the sensors on the ground as well. So it's really critical. We cannot first of all, we cannot understand where we are with our climate challenges without using space technology. And secondly, we definitely can't implement the necessary changes in a meaningful way without space technology. So it's an absolutely critical part of what we do. I think everybody on this panel feels that already. And I think it's generally becoming the understood position now. I think the question is really, how good does it have to be? There are examples of really good commercial organizations doing very clever things. We talked about methane monitoring. You know, there's a company called WGIC, commercial company doing methane monitoring, point source monitoring in a really capable way. It's probably going to be better in 10 years' time, but it's good enough now. And if we wait for 10 years or 5 years or 15 years to get a quality of scientific data that somehow meets a gold standard, then actually we miss this window of opportunity to make the fixes we need to make and hit our 1.5 degrees. So I think back to one of your earlier questions, what I really want to see us doing is making sure we take action now with what's good enough, and not continuing to research only. Research is important and it feeds the future, but we need to turn that now into real action. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people are saying that. I think Alok Sharma's position in the UK is very much about delivering on commitments now. And our chief scientific advisor in the UK is talking about science for solutions rather than science for science sake. So we really need to push that now. Any organization, any nation that's got capabilities that can be used to help us monitor, help us prevent, help us manage some of our decisions around what's acceptable, we really need to take hold of that and use it. And that will create the commercial environment as well that allows these to be sustainable solutions.
Okay, fantastic, Nick. I'm sorry, we're out of time, and I was going to come to you, Nick, but instead, what I can do is I can pledge to look up petabytes, which is a new word for me that you've taught me in today's panel. So we've already got our homework, but perhaps Nick, just some closing. I'll outsource my closing remarks to you, Nick, for the last 30 seconds of what your thoughts listening to all of this.
Well, I just wanted to sort of follow on and say you can't change what you can't measure, so the measurement is really important. And a huge amount of the implementation that needs to be done in order to make change has to be done within the private sector. So we need to see not just sort of these monitoring capabilities, but we need to see actual change happening. So that means we need to see more innovation. We need to see people thinking through what can they actually do. So we're in a period now where innovation is essential if we're going to hit our targets. And so that means everyone working together, the investment needs to be there, the thinking needs to be there, the cooperation, collaboration needs to be there. So I think my summary, and I'd like to hear others if possible, but my summary would be collaboration is really the key in order for us to move forwards.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm afraid I have to shut it down for time purposes, and we get to our other panelists as well, but it's been wonderful speaking to all of you, and thanks for sharing your insights with us today. Well, that brings us to the end of our second event in this series on the intersection of space-based technology and the battle against climate change. Thanks to all of our speakers. We had on-the-ground experience from Fiji and Samoa. We had an insight into the UN Secretary General's thinking about this, and we're looking forward to the upcoming compendium of United Nations solutions, I suppose, to climate issues and the intersection with space. And from our final panelists, a reminder that there's plenty of great technology already in existence that we have at our disposal and should be brought to bear on these pressing issues as soon as possible. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to our partners at the Satellite Applications Catapult, and keep an eye out for our third event in the series coming soon. Thanks very much.